There comes a moment in every person's life when they must choose between what others expect and what their heart knows is right. For Alpha King Eryk, that moment arrived when his council demanded he marry for politics, while his soul yearned for something true. In the ancient kingdom of Vaelthorne, where bloodlines meant everything and strength ruled all, the newly crowned king shocked his court by choosing the one woman everyone warned him against. Elira was known as the Rejected One, a quiet healer who lived alone, whispered about in shadowed corners, accused of witchcraft and left for dead years before. His advisors pleaded with him to reconsider. The nobles threatened rebellion. Yet when Eryk looked into her eyes, he saw a strength that no royal bloodline could match, and a wisdom that no amount of gold could buy. What ancient secret did this mysterious woman carry that would shake his kingdom to its very core? Before we continue this tale, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The crown of Vaelthorne weighed heavier than iron, and King Eryk Thorne knew this truth better than most. At 34, he'd worn it for barely 6 moons, yet already the weight threatened to crush not just his shoulders, but his spirit. The ancient seat of power, carved from black stone and adorned with crystals that once hummed with magic, now felt like a cage that grew smaller each day. The great hall stretched before him like a cavern, its vaulted ceilings disappearing into shadows that seemed to whisper of centuries past. Tapestries depicting his ancestors' victories hung from the walls, warriors who had built this kingdom with sword and blood, men who had never questioned their duty or wrestled with the loneliness that came with absolute power. Their painted eyes seemed to judge him, to find him wanting in ways he could not articulate. "Your Majesty," came the familiar voice of Lord Commander Aldrich, his boots echoing against the stone as he approached the throne. The man's weathered face bore the scars of a dozen campaigns, and his grey beard spoke of wisdom earned through hardship. "The council awaits your presence," Eryk nodded, rising from the throne that had belonged to his father and his father's father before him. The ancient crown settled heavier as he stood, its weight a constant reminder of expectations that stretched back through generations. Each step toward the council chamber felt like walking deeper into a web of obligations that threatened to strangle the man beneath the king. The council chamber buzzed with tension when he entered. 7 men sat around the massive oak table, their faces drawn with concern and barely concealed frustration. Maps covered the surface, marked with colored stones that represented armies, trade routes, and threats both foreign and domestic. The war table had seen countless strategies unfold across its scarred surface. But today it bore witness to a different kind of battle, one fought not with swords, but with words and wills. "Majesty," Lord Cassius stood, his silk robes rustling. The man's soft hands and rounded belly spoke of a life spent in comfort, yet his sharp eyes missed nothing. As keeper of the royal treasury, he wielded influence through coin rather than sword. "We must address the matter of succession. The kingdom requires an heir, and for that you need a queen." The words hit Eryk like stones thrown at glass. He had known this conversation was coming, had dreaded it through sleepless nights when even wine could not quiet his restless mind. Around the table, 6 other pairs of eyes watched him, waiting for the response they believed inevitable. "The House of Ravencrest has offered their eldest daughter," continued Lord Garrett, his military bearing evident even while seated. "Lady Morgana brings significant dowry and strong political alliance with the eastern provinces. House Blackwater proposes Lady Vivienne," added another council member, his voice eager. "Her family controls the largest grain stores in the southern reaches. Such a union would secure our food supplies for decades." Eryk listened to each proposal, watching as the men he trusted most treated his future as though it were another piece on their strategic board. They spoke of dowries and alliances, of political advantages and military support. Not once did any mention love, companionship, or the simple human need for connection that gnawed at his chest like a hungry wolf. His thoughts drifted, as they often did these days, to memories of genuine laughter. Not the calculated merriment of court functions, but the spontaneous joy of shared understanding. He remembered his younger years, before the crown claimed him, when he could walk among his people without ceremony or guard. Those days felt like someone else's life now, a story heard second-hand about a man who might have been happy. The neighbouring kingdoms watch us closely. Lord Cassius pressed on. King Aldwyn of Drakmore has 3 unmarried daughters. A union there would secure our western border, or make us appear weak, countered Lord Garrett. Better to show strength through military alliance. The Ravencrest proposal offers the most tactical advantage. Back and forth they argued, their voices rising as passion overcame decorum. Eryk watched them with growing detachment, these men who had served his father faithfully, and now sought to shape his destiny according to their vision of royal duty. They meant well, he knew. Their concern for the kingdom was genuine, their loyalty beyond question. Yet something in their certainty felt wrong, like wearing armor that belonged to another man. The debate continued until Lord Aldrich, who had remained silent, finally spoke. Perhaps His Majesty wishes to share his thoughts on these proposals. 7 pairs of eyes turned toward him, expectant and hopeful. These men had given their lives to serve the crown, had sacrificed personal desires for duty to the realm. They deserved honesty, even if that honesty might disappoint them. I understand your concerns, Eryk said carefully, his voice carrying the measured tone he had learned to use when navigating treacherous political waters. The kingdom does need stability, and heir would certainly provide that. Murmurs of approval rippled around the table. Lord Cassius leaned forward, sensing victory within reach. However, Eryk continued, and the word fell like a sword cutting through their optimism, I will not marry for convenience alone. The crown has taken much from me already. I will not surrender the choice of who shares my life to political necessity. The silence that followed felt heavy as storm clouds. Lord Garrett's jaw tightened, and Lord Cassius's soft features hardened into something resembling disapproval. Other council members exchanged glances that spoke of frustration and barely contained arguments. Majesty, Lord Aldrich said gently, his weathered features creased with concern that seemed genuine rather than calculated. My father married for love, Eryk interrupted, his voice sharper than intended. He chose my mother not because she brought political advantage, but because she brought him joy. Their union strengthened the kingdom precisely because it was built on genuine partnership rather than mere alliance. The reminder of his parents' legendary devotion silenced several potential objections. King Aldrich had indeed married for love, and their union had become the stuff of songs and stories. Yet that love had also ended in tragedy when bandits took the Queen's life during what should have been a peaceful journey to visit the eastern provinces. Love is a luxury, Lord Cassius said finally, his tone careful but firm. Your parents' happiness was a blessing, but it was also fortunate that her family brought no political complications. We cannot count on such fortune again, can we not? Eryk asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Or have we simply convinced ourselves that happiness and duty must be enemies? The question hung in the air like incense, heavy and lingering. Around the table, men who had spent decades navigating the complex currents of political necessity struggled to find an answer that would satisfy both their king's heart and their own sense of responsibility to the realm. It was then, in that moment of uncomfortable silence, that Eryk's thoughts turned, as they had with increasing frequency, to a pair of green eyes he had glimpsed in the village market, eyes that held depths he longed to explore, belonging to a woman who lived apart from the intricate web of court politics and noble ambitions, a woman whose very existence seemed to promise something different, something real in a world grown artificial with ceremony and calculation. The council session ended without resolution, as Eryk knew it must. His advisers filed out, with expressions ranging from concerned to frustrated, leaving him alone with the weight of expectations and the growing certainty that the path to happiness lay not among the noble houses they championed, But in the quiet corners of his kingdom, where authenticity still flourished like wildflowers in an untended garden. 3 days later, the great hall transformed into a stage for the kingdom's most eligible daughters. Banners bearing the crests of noble houses lined the walls, and servants hurried about arranging chairs and preparing refreshments as if the kingdom's future could be decided over wine and sweet cakes. The air hummed with anticipation and barely concealed ambition as families positioned themselves for the greatest prize of all, a queen's crown. Eryk sat upon his throne, the golden betrothal ring of his ancestors heavy in his palm. The ancient band had sealed royal marriages for 7 generations, its surface worn smooth by the hands of kings who had placed it on fingers chosen for them by duty rather than desire. Today, according to tradition and his council's fervent hopes, he would present it to the woman who would bear his children and share his crown. Lord Cassius stood at his right hand, a scroll containing carefully researched details about each candidate. The man's excitement was palpable, his earlier frustrations forgotten in the face of what he clearly saw as inevitable victory. Around the hall, the kingdom's most powerful families waited with their daughters, each woman a masterpiece of preparation and political calculation. Lady Morgana of House Ravencrest entered first, her midnight hair arranged in elaborate braids woven with silver thread. She moved with the calculated grace of someone trained from birth to capture royal attention, her smile precise and her curtsy perfectly measured. Behind her walked her father, Lord Marcus Ravencrest, whose scarred hands and proud bearing spoke of military service that would strengthen any alliance. "Your Majesty," Lady Morgana's voice carried the cultured tones of noble education. "House Ravencrest stands ready to serve the crown in all things." She was beautiful, Eryk acknowledged privately. Intelligent, too, if the reports were accurate. Her family commanded respect throughout the eastern provinces, and their armies would prove valuable in the uncertain times ahead. By every measure his council valued, she represented an ideal choice. Lady Vivian Blackwater followed, her golden hair catching the light from the great hall's windows. Where Lady Morgana projected strength, Lady Vivian embodied grace, her movements flowing like water over stones. Her family's wealth could feed the kingdom through harsh winters, and her reputation for charity had earned her genuine affection among the common folk. One by one, they came forward. Lady Catherine of House Stormwind, whose father controlled the kingdom's largest port. Lady Eleanor Greycliffe, descended from a line of renowned scholars and magical practitioners from the time before such arts were driven underground. Lady Isabella Thornfield, whose beauty was matched only by her family's influence in the Western Territories. Each woman represented a different advantage, a unique path toward securing the kingdom's future. They had been trained for this moment, prepared to become queens from the time they could walk. Their educations included languages, politics, military strategy, and the subtle arts of royal diplomacy. Any one of them would serve admirably as his queen. Yet as each candidate stepped forward to offer their carefully rehearsed greetings, Eryk felt a growing emptiness in his chest. Their words, while perfectly chosen, rang hollow in his ears. Their smiles, though lovely, seemed painted on like masks worn to conceal their true thoughts. He found himself wondering what these women dreamed of when alone, what made them laugh without reservation, what fears kept them awake in the dark hours before dawn. The presentations continued for what felt like hours, each family offering their daughter like a prize to be claimed. Eryk responded with the appropriate words, asked the questions his station demanded, and maintained the facade of a king seriously considering his options. Yet with each passing moment, his certainty grew that none of these worthy women could fill the aching loneliness that had become his constant companion. It was Lord Aldrich who finally spoke the words everyone anticipated. "Your Majesty, surely one of these fine ladies has captured your interest. The kingdom awaits your decision." The great hall fell silent. Every eye turned toward the throne, where Eryk sat with the betrothal ring still warm in his palm. He could feel the weight of their expectations, the collective held breath of nobles who had invested their daughters' futures in this moment. Behind their polite expressions, he sensed the calculations spinning like clockwork, which family would rise to unprecedented power, which alliances would shift, which futures would be made or broken by his next words. Eryk stood slowly, the ancient ring catching the light as he held it high for all to see. The gesture brought murmurs of excitement from the assembled families, certain that the moment of selection had arrived. Even his council leaned forward, eager to witness the culmination of their careful planning. This ring, Eryk's voice carried clearly through the hall, has bound 7 generations of my family in marriages of duty. Each queen who wore it served the kingdom faithfully, sacrificing personal happiness for the good of the realm. Approving nods rippled through the audience. This was the speech they expected, the prelude to a selection that would validate their understanding of royal responsibility. But I have been thinking, Eryk continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, about what makes a kingdom truly strong. Is it the sum of our alliances, the weight of our gold, the size of our armies? Or is it something more fundamental? The honesty between ruler and ruled, the authenticity of those who lead. Confused glances began to pass between the noble families. This was not the direction they had anticipated, and uncertainty crept into expressions that moments before had been confident. I have seen each of your daughters, Eryk said, his gaze moving across the assembled women. They are accomplished, intelligent, and beautiful. Any king would be honored to call one of them his queen. Yet I cannot in good conscience ask any woman to bind herself to a man whose heart belongs elsewhere. The silence that followed felt like the moment before thunder. Lord Cassius's face had gone pale, while Lord Garrett's hand instinctively moved toward his sword hilt. Around the hall, noble fathers began to realize that their carefully laid plans were crumbling like sandcastles before an unexpected tide. There is a woman in this kingdom, Eryk continued, his voice growing quieter but somehow more commanding, who has captured not just my attention but my heart. She possesses no title, commands no armies, controls no treasury. Yet she embodies something I have found nowhere else, a courage born of surviving the worst this world can offer, a wisdom earned through hardship, and a truth uncompromised by ambition. He paused, letting his words settle like stones thrown into still water, their ripples spreading outward to touch every corner of the great hall. I choose Elira of the wildlands, she who tends the sick without thought of payment, who has faced darkness and emerged stronger, who asks nothing of me but honesty in return. She will be my queen if she consents to share the burden of this crown. The explosion of voices that followed nearly shook the ancient stones of the hall. Lord Marcus Ravencrest surged to his feet, his military bearing forgotten in the face of political catastrophe. This is madness. You speak of some village hedge witch while spurning the finest daughters of the realm. She has no name, no family, no dowry, shouted Lord Blackwater, his face flushed with indignation. What alliance does this choice bring? What strength does she add to the kingdom? Other voices joined the chaos, noble fathers and ambitious mothers crying out in disbelief and fury. The careful order of the selection ceremony dissolved into something approaching chaos, with several families already beginning to storm from the hall in outraged dignity. Through it all, Eryk remained standing, the betrothal ring still in his hand. He had known this moment would come, had prepared himself for their reaction. Yet hearing their objections voiced so loudly, seeing the genuine shock and anger on faces he had trusted, made the reality of his choice feel both more frightening and more necessary than ever. It was Lady Morgana herself who finally spoke above the din, her voice cutting through the noise with surprising authority. "Your Majesty," she said, and there was something in her tone that commanded attention. "While I confess disappointment at your decision, I must ask, does this woman know of your intentions? Has she agreed to accept a crown that comes with such complications?" The question silenced the hall more effectively than any royal decree. All eyes turned back to Eryk, waiting for an answer that he could not yet provide. In his haste to follow his heart, he had declared his choice without securing the consent of the woman he intended to elevate. The realization struck him like a physical blow. He had potentially placed Elira in terrible danger without even consulting her wishes. "She does not yet know," he admitted, his voice carrying a humility that somehow made him seem more kingly than any crown could. "But I intend to speak with her immediately. If she refuses, then I will remain unmarried until I can find someone who can give me what I seek, not just political advantage, but genuine partnership built on mutual respect and affection." The admission sent another wave of shock through the assembly. A king who would remain unmarried rather than compromise his heart. It was unprecedented, potentially disastrous for succession, and completely contrary to everything the nobility understood about royal duty. As the noble families began to file out, their expressions ranging from stunned to furious, Eryk caught sight of his council members huddled in urgent conversation. Their faces told the story clearly. They believed their king had lost his mind, and they were already plotting how to minimize the damage to the kingdom. But in that moment, standing alone on the dais with the weight of tradition and expectation crashing down around him, Eryk felt something he had not experienced since taking the crown. For the first time in months, he felt truly alive. The sun had barely risen over the village of Millbrook when Eryk rode out alone, his royal guard trailing at a respectful distance. The cobblestone streets gave way to dirt paths as he approached the outskirts, where simple cottages dotted the landscape like scattered seeds. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the morning air carried the scent of baking bread and wood fires, honest smells that spoke of lives lived without the complexity of court politics. Elira's cottage sat apart from the others, as it had for the 3 years since she had arrived in the village, more dead than alive. The modest structure was well maintained despite its isolation, with herbs growing in neat rows along the southern wall and wind chimes fashioned from polished stones, creating soft music in the morning breeze. A small wooden sign by the gate bore a simple inscription, "Healing offered freely to those in need." Eryk dismounted and approached the door, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird. Through the window, he could see movement, a slender figure tending to someone on a low cot, her movements gentle and practiced. This was the woman who had unknowingly captured a king's heart, who possessed no title or wealth, yet commanded a respect that gold could never purchase. The door opened before he could knock, and Elira emerged carrying a basin of water tinted pink with blood. She froze upon seeing him, her green eyes widening in surprise. Up close, she was even more striking than memory had painted her. Not beautiful in the polished way of court ladies, but possessed of something far more compelling. There was strength in the set of her shoulders, kindness in the curve of her mouth, and a depth in her gaze that spoke of someone who had looked into darkness and chosen light. "Your Majesty," she said softly, setting down the basin and offering a curtsy that was respectful but not subservient. "I was not expecting, that is, how may I serve you?" "I have come to ask you something," Eryk replied, suddenly aware of how inadequate words seemed for what he needed to express. "Something that may sound like madness, but which feels like the sanest decision I have ever made." Elira studied his face, and he found himself holding his breath under her scrutiny. There was no calculation in her expression, no attempt to determine what answer might benefit her most. Instead, she seemed to be looking for truth, and the realization that she would accept nothing less made his chest tighten with something between fear and exhilaration. "Come inside," she said finally. "We should not have such a conversation in the open." Her cottage was modest but spotless, filled with the scent of drying herbs and polished wood. Bundles of medicinal plants hung from the rafters, and shelves lined with jars of powders and tinctures spoke of knowledge accumulated through careful study and practice. On the cot lay an elderly man, his breathing shallow but steady, a bandage covering what appeared to be a serious wound on his shoulder. Marcus was attacked by bandits 2 days ago. Elira explained, following his gaze. They left him for dead, but his grandson found him and brought him here. He will live, though it will be some time before he can work his fields again. The matter-of-fact way she spoke of saving a life struck Eryk as profoundly different from the way his court celebrated far lesser accomplishments. Here was a woman who performed miracles daily and treated them as simple acts of human kindness. "Elira," he began, then stopped, struggling to find words that would not sound rehearsed or calculating. "Yesterday I was presented with a choice. The finest daughters of the kingdom's most powerful families, each offering advantages that would strengthen my reign and secure the kingdom's future." She nodded, her expression carefully neutral. "And did you find what you were looking for among them?" "No," he said simply, "because what I am looking for, I have found here, in this cottage, in your hands as you tend the wounded, in your eyes as you refuse to turn away from suffering." Elira's breath caught, and for a moment something flickered across her face. Hope, perhaps, or recognition of something she had tried not to acknowledge. But then her expression hardened, and she shook her head. "Your Majesty, I am honored by your words, but you do not know me." "Not truly. The stories they tell, they call you the rejected one," Eryk interrupted gently. "They whisper of dark magic and curses, of powers that should be feared. I have heard these whispers, and I do not care about them. You should care." The words burst from her with surprising force. "Do you know why I was left for dead? Do you understand what it means to be marked as different in a world that fears anything it cannot control?" Eryk stepped closer, his voice soft but unwavering. "Then tell me. Help me understand what made you the woman I see before me, someone who has faced the worst this world offers and chosen to respond with healing rather than hatred." For a long moment, Elira stood silent, her hands clasped tightly before her. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of old pain carefully controlled. "I was 19 when they came for my family. The plague had struck our village, and people were dying faster than we could bury them. My grandmother was the local healer, and she taught me her arts, how to read the signs in plants and stones, how to draw upon the earth's own strength to mend what was broken." She moved to the window, gazing out at the herb garden where morning light played across leaves still heavy with dew. "When the plague finally broke, when the dying stopped, they said it was too convenient. How could a family of hedge witches survive when so many others perished? Surely we had made bargains with dark powers, traded our neighbors' lives for our own." The whispers began, then grew louder, until finally they became shouts of accusation. Eryk felt his hands clench into fists as he imagined the scene, frightened people seeking someone to blame, turning on those who had tried to help them. "They came at night," Elira continued, her voice growing distant with memory. 20 men with torches and ropes, demanding justice for crimes we never committed. My grandmother told me to run, to use the old paths through the forest that she had shown me as a child. I wanted to stay, to fight beside her, but she made me promise to live, to carry on what she had taught me. And your family? Dead by morning, burned in their beds for the crime of knowing how to heal." Her voice remained steady, but Eryk could see the tension in her shoulders, the careful control that kept grief from overwhelming her, even after so many years. "The men who killed them hunted me for 3 days through the wilderness. When they finally caught me, they beat me nearly to death and left me in a ravine, certain the wolves would finish what they had started. But I survived, as my grandmother had taught me to do, and eventually I made my way here, to a place where no one knew my history." She turned back to face him, her green eyes bright with unshed tears, but also with a fierce determination that took his breath away. "So you see, Your Majesty, I am indeed the rejected one. I carry the blood of those your subjects call witches, and my very existence is a reminder of powers they would rather believe extinct. If you make me your queen, you invite rebellion not just from ambitious nobles, but from common folk who still fear what they do not understand." Eryk crossed the room to stand before her, his voice gentle but absolutely certain. "And yet you chose to continue healing, even knowing the risks." Even after losing everything, you still open your door to the wounded and refuse payment from those who cannot afford it. That courage, that unwillingness to let bitterness corrupt your gifts, that is what I need beside me. Not political advantage, but moral strength. Elira searched his face, looking for the calculation or expedience that she clearly expected to find. When she saw only sincerity, her careful composure finally cracked, and a single tear traced its way down her cheek. "They will try to destroy you for choosing me," she whispered. "Let them try," Eryk replied, reaching up to gently wipe away the tear with his thumb. "A kingdom built on fear and prejudice is not worth preserving, but a kingdom where healing is valued over hatred, where courage matters more than bloodline, that is something worth fighting for." Before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses echoed from outside the cottage. Through the window, they could see a dozen riders in royal colors surrounding the building, their expressions grim and their hands resting on weapon hilts. Lord Cassius dismounted and approached the door, his usually soft features hard with disapproval. Behind him stood several other council members, their faces reflecting varying degrees of anger and determination. "Your Majesty," Lord Cassius called out, his voice carrying clearly through the cottage walls, "we must speak with you immediately. There are urgent matters of state that require your attention." Eryk and Elira exchanged a look of understanding. The honeyed words could not disguise the threat implicit in the council's arrival. They had come not to escort their king home, but to end what they saw as dangerous madness before it could spread further. "It begins," Elira said quietly, her hand instinctively moving to a small pouch at her belt, the one containing the herbs and remedies that had saved so many lives, but which others would see only as evidence of forbidden practices. Eryk nodded, his jaw setting with determination. "Then we face it together if you are willing." She looked into his eyes one final time, seeing there not the calculating politician she had expected, but a man as weary of loneliness as she was. Someone who understood that true strength came not from power over others, but from the courage to remain authentic in a world that demanded conformity. "I am willing," she said simply, and the words felt like a vow that would reshape the destiny of the kingdom. The confrontation outside Elira's cottage had ended without bloodshed, but the tension that followed hung over the castle like storm clouds waiting to break. Lord Cassius and the council had made their position clear. The king's choice was unacceptable, a threat to the stability of the realm. Yet Eryk had stood firm, and for now the matter remained unresolved, while both sides gathered their strength for the battles to come. 3 days later, Brother Marcus, the castle's ancient librarian, appeared at Eryk's private chambers with a leather satchel clutched in his weathered hands. The old monk's eyes burned with excitement, tempered by what appeared to be deep concern. "Your Majesty," Brother Marcus said, his voice trembling slightly, "I have been researching your chosen bride as you requested. What I have discovered may change everything." Eryk set aside the reports he had been reviewing and gestured for the elderly man to sit. Brother Marcus had served the royal family for 40 years. His knowledge of the kingdom's history unmatched by any living scholar. If anyone could uncover the truth about Elira's past, it would be him. "Show me," Eryk said simply. With reverent care, Brother Marcus withdrew a scroll from his satchel. The parchment was old, its edges yellowed with age, and the writing upon it bore the distinctive script of the kingdom's founding era. Symbols that had not been used in common writing for centuries adorned the margins, their meanings known only to the most learned historians. "This is a genealogical record from the time of King Aldwin I," Brother Marcus explained, unrolling the scroll across Eryk's desk. "It details the bloodlines of the kingdom's founding families, including those who possessed what the ancients called the gift of the earth, the ability to commune with natural forces for healing and protection." Eryk leaned forward, studying the faded text. Among the many family names listed, one stood out in slightly different ink, as though it had been added later: House of Moon Whisper, guardians of the sacred grove, keepers of the ancient healing arts. The Moon Whispers were among the kingdom's most honored families. Brother Marcus continued. They served as advisors to the early kings, using their abilities to protect the realm from plague, famine, and the darker magics that sometimes crept in from the wild lands beyond our borders. What happened to them? Eryk asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Brother Marcus's expression darkened. The Great Purge 3 generations ago. Your great-grandfather, King Aldwin III, became convinced that magical bloodlines represented a threat to royal authority. He ordered the systematic elimination of all families known to possess supernatural abilities. The words hit Eryk like physical blows. His own ancestor had orchestrated the destruction of people like Elira, had turned the kingdom against its protectors out of fear and jealousy. The irony was bitter. In seeking to strengthen the throne, his great-grandfather had likely weakened the kingdom by eliminating those who could have defended it against threats no army could face. But some survived, Brother Marcus said, his finger tracing along the scroll's margin where additional notes had been written in a different hand. This addendum was made by Brother Aldred, my predecessor. He recorded that several Moon Whisper children were hidden by sympathetic families, their identities obscured to protect them from the purge. And you believe Elira. I believe Elira of the Wildlands is the last surviving heir of House Moon Whisper, Brother Marcus said firmly. Her healing abilities, her knowledge of herbs and natural remedies, even her physical features match the descriptions in these records. But there is more, Your Majesty. Something that makes this discovery far more significant than mere historical curiosity. The old monk withdrew another scroll, this one even more ancient than the first. The parchment was so fragile that it seemed likely to crumble at a touch, and the writing upon it appeared to shimmer in the candlelight, as though the ink itself possessed some otherworldly quality. This is the prophecy of the United Crown, Brother Marcus said, his voice dropping to a whisper. It was recorded by the last of the great seers, just before magical practitioners were driven from the court. For centuries, it has been dismissed as the desperate hope of a dying tradition. Eryk read the ancient text aloud, his voice growing stronger with each line. When shadow falls across the land and ancient enemies wake from sleep, the crown alone shall not withstand the powers from the darkest deep. But when the warrior takes to wife the last daughter of the sacred line, their union shall restore to life the kingdom's strength of old design. 2 hearts as one, 2 powers joined, the earthbound gift, the royal flame. Together they shall be anointed to heal the realm and end the shame. Silence filled the chamber as the implications of the prophecy settled between them. If Brother Marcus was correct, if Elira truly was the last of the Moon Whisper line, then Eryk's choice might be more than personal preference. It could be destiny itself. There are more records, Brother Marcus said, his excitement overriding his usual scholarly caution. References to rituals and ceremonies that could awaken dormant abilities, techniques for combining royal authority with natural magic to protect the kingdom from threats both seen and unseen. Before Eryk could respond, a commotion in the corridor outside drew their attention. Raised voices echoed through the stone walls, and the sound of running feet suggested some crisis had erupted in the castle's daily routine. The chamber door burst open without ceremony, and Sir Gareth, captain of the Royal Guard, stumbled inside. His face was pale with shock, and blood stained the sleeve of his uniform. Behind him came 2 other guardsmen, supporting between them a figure Eryk recognized as Thomas the Baker, one of the village's most respected citizens. "Your Majesty," Sir Gareth gasped, struggling to maintain his composure, "there has been an attack. Someone tried to poison Lady Elira." The words hit Eryk like lightning, galvanizing him into action. He was moving before conscious thought could interfere. Brother Marcus's scrolls forgotten, as fear for Elira's safety overwhelmed all other considerations. "Tell me everything," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to crisis. "It happened this morning," Thomas the baker wheezed, his face grey with pain and exhaustion. "I brought bread to her cottage, as I do every week. She invited me in for tea, as she always does." "Kind woman never asks for payment, though I know she has little." The baker paused to catch his breath, and Sir Gareth picked up the narrative. "The tea was poisoned, Your Majesty. Something called wolfsbane, according to Lady Elira. Deadly in the amounts that were used." "But how?" Eryk began, then understanding struck him like a physical blow. "She tasted it first," Thomas nodded weakly. "Aye, she did. Took a full swallow before I even touched my cup. When she realized what was happening, she made me vomit up what little I'd drunk, then forced some kind of antidote down both our throats. Saved my life, she did, though it nearly cost her own." "Where is she now?" Eryk demanded. "At her cottage, recovering," Sir Gareth replied. "She refused to come to the castle, said it would only make things worse." "But, Your Majesty, the implications, someone with access to her daily routine, knowledge of her habits. This wasn't random violence." Eric's mind raced through the possibilities. The timing was too convenient, coming just days after his public declaration. Someone had decided that if they could not dissuade the king from his choice, they would eliminate the choice itself. "Double the guard around her cottage," he ordered, discreetly but effectively. "And I want to know who had access to her tea supplies." "Already done, Your Majesty," Sir Gareth replied. "But there's more. Lady Elira asked me to give you this." The captain produced a small glass vial filled with dark liquid. Even from across the room, Eryk could smell its bitter, acrid scent, the unmistakable odor of wolfsbane. "She said you needed to see the poison itself," Sir Gareth explained. "Said it would tell you something important about who was responsible." Brother Marcus, who had been examining the vial with growing alarm, suddenly spoke up. "Your Majesty, this is not ordinary wolfsbane. The concentration is far higher than what any village herbalist could prepare. And there are other compounds mixed in, things that would require extensive knowledge of alchemical practices." The implications were clear. This was not the work of some angry villager or superstitious farmer. Someone with sophisticated knowledge of poisons had attempted to murder Elira. Someone with resources and connections that suggested noble involvement. "The attack confirms something else," Brother Marcus continued, his voice troubled. "If Lady Elira truly possesses the Moon Whisper bloodline, then her survival of such a potent poison supports the theory. The ancient records speak of natural resistances that protected the healing families from the very toxins they worked with." Eryk absorbed this information, pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. The attack on Elira was not just an attempt to remove an inconvenient bride. It was an assault on something far more significant. If the prophecy was true, if Elira's bloodline held power that could strengthen the kingdom, then her death would leave the realm vulnerable to threats his advisors might not even recognize. "Sir Gareth," he said finally, his voice carrying a new edge of determination, "I want a full investigation. Question everyone who had contact with Lady Elira in the past week. Check the backgrounds of all servants, merchants, anyone who might have had opportunity to tamper with her supplies. And if we find noble involvement, then we will deal with it accordingly," Eryk replied, his tone leaving no doubt about his resolve. "Attempt to murder the woman I intend to marry is treason, regardless of the perpetrator's rank." As the guardsman escorted Thomas the baker to the castle's infirmary for proper treatment, Eryk found himself alone again with Brother Marcus and the ancient scrolls that had revealed so much. The attack had changed everything, transforming what might have been dismissed as romantic folly into something far more serious. "Brother Marcus," he said quietly, "I need you to research everything you can find about the Moon Whisper bloodline, their abilities, their weaknesses, their enemies. If Elira is truly the last of their line, then we need to understand what that means for the kingdom." The old monk nodded solemnly. "And the prophecy, Your Majesty? Do you believe—" "I believe that someone is willing to commit murder to prevent my marriage to Elira," Eryk interrupted. "Whether that's because of politics, prophecy, or simple prejudice doesn't matter. What matters is that they've made this personal." He moved to the window. gazing out toward the village where Elira was recovering from an attempt on her life. An attempt that might have succeeded if not for the very abilities her attackers sought to eliminate. The irony was not lost on him. In trying to destroy her, they had only proven her worth. "There's something else, Your Majesty," Brother Marcus said hesitantly. "In my research, I discovered references to other surviving magical bloodlines. Families who went into hiding during the Great Purge, who might still exist in secret throughout the kingdom." The implications struck Eryk immediately. If Elira was not alone, if other descendants of the ancient magical families had survived, then the kingdom possessed resources it had forgotten. More importantly, it meant that those who opposed magical bloodlines had more targets than just the woman he intended to marry. "Find them," he said simply. "If there are others like Elira, they deserve protection. And if the old prophecies are true, we may need their help more than we know." As Brother Marcus gathered his scrolls and prepared to depart, Eryk made a decision that would reshape everything that followed. He would not simply marry Elira despite the opposition. He would use their union to restore something the kingdom had lost, to reclaim powers and protections that had been cast aside in fear and ignorance. The attack on Elira had been meant to end his defiance of tradition. Instead, it had convinced him that tradition itself might be the kingdom's greatest enemy, and that true strength lay not in maintaining old prejudices, but in embracing the very differences those prejudices sought to destroy. The assassin struck at dawn, when the mist still clung to the ancient oaks like ghostly fingers. Eryk had insisted on personally escorting Elira to the sacred grove, where her grandmother had once taught her the deepest secrets of the healing arts. Despite the increased guard presence, he refused to let fear keep either of them imprisoned within castle walls. The shadow blade whistled past his ear with supernatural silence, embedding itself in the oak tree where his head had been mere heartbeats before. The metal itself seemed wrong, darker than steel, carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly, radiating a cold that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Down!" Eryk shouted, throwing himself over Elira as more blades materialized from the mist. These were not ordinary weapons wielded by common bandits, but instruments of dark craft that moved with their own malevolent purpose. Sir Gareth and his men formed a protective circle, their swords drawn and shields raised, but Eryk could see the uncertainty in their faces. How did one fight enemies who could strike from shadows, whose weapons seemed to bend the very air around them? It was then that something extraordinary happened. Elira, pressed beneath Eryk's protective embrace, began to glow with a soft green light that seemed to emanate from her very skin. The light pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, and where it touched the unnatural shadows, they recoiled as though burned. "The grove!" she gasped, her voice strained but determined. "We need to reach the sacred grove. The old protections still hold there." Without hesitation, Eryk helped her to her feet, his arm around her waist as they ran deeper into the forest. Behind them, he could hear Sir Gareth shouting orders, the clash of steel against steel, and stranger sounds, whispers in languages that should not exist. The crack of air being torn by forces beyond nature. The grove itself was ancient beyond measure, a circle of massive oaks whose trunks bore spiral carvings that predated the kingdom itself. As they stumbled into the sacred space, Elira collapsed to her knees, her hands pressing against the earth with desperate urgency. "Grandmother," she whispered, and power responded to her call. The very ground beneath them began to shimmer with the same green light that had protected them from the shadow blades. Roots emerged from the earth, weaving themselves into barriers that pulsed with protective magic. The air itself grew thick with energy, and Eryk felt the hair on his arm stand on end as forces older than memory awakened at Elira's touch. The attacking shadows retreated to the edge of the grove, unable to penetrate the ancient defenses, but their presence remained, a constant reminder that safety was temporary at best. Through the protective barrier, Eryk could see shapes moving in the mist, waiting with inhuman patience for the magic to fade. How long will it hold? he asked, drawing his sword despite knowing that steel would be useless against their enemies. "I don't know," Elira admitted, sweat beading on her forehead from the effort of maintaining the protective circle. "These defenses were built by a dozen of my ancestors working together. I'm trying to channel power that was meant for many, not one." Even as she spoke, cracks began to appear in the barrier of light. The shadows pressed closer, testing the weakening defenses with increasing boldness. Whatever dark magic powered their attackers, it was strong enough to erode even the ancient protections of the sacred grove. It was Sir Gareth who saved them, arriving with reinforcements just as the barriers finally collapsed. But even his skilled warriors struggled against enemies that could melt into shadow and strike from impossible angles. The battle raged around the grove's perimeter, steel meeting supernatural darkness in a conflict that should have been the stuff of legends rather than grim reality. There, Elira suddenly pointed toward a figure standing apart from the chaos, hands raised in gestures of power that fed strength to the shadow assassins. "The summoner. If we can disrupt his concentration, the shadows will lose their coherence." The figure wore robes of deepest black, his face hidden beneath a hood that seemed to devour light itself. But it was not his appearance that chilled Eryk's blood. It was the familiar stance, the way he held his shoulders, a gesture he had seen countless times in the castle's council chamber. "Impossible," he breathed. But even as denial rose in his throat, certainty settled in his chest like a stone. "Lord Matthias." Elira followed his gaze, and her face went pale with recognition and betrayal. Lord Matthias had been among the more moderate council members, one who had expressed concern about Eryk's choice, but had not joined the loudest voices of opposition. The revelation that he was not merely opposing the marriage, but actively seeking to murder the bride, struck both of them like a physical blow. "How long has he been working against us?" Elira whispered. "Long enough to learn our movements, our habits, our vulnerabilities," Eryk replied grimly. The poisoning attempt, the precise timing of this attack, the knowledge of Elira's connection to the sacred grove, all of it spoke of careful planning by someone with intimate access to their daily routines. But there was no time for further speculation. The protective barrier around them flickered and died, leaving them exposed to the shadow assassin's assault. Eryk raised his sword, knowing it was inadequate, but refusing to die without a fight. When Elira's hand closed over his, "Trust me," she said simply, and power flowed between them like lightning-seeking earth. The sensation was unlike anything Eryk had ever experienced. Raw energy coursed through his veins, setting every nerve afire while simultaneously filling him with strength beyond mortal limits. His sword began to glow with the same green light that had protected them, its blade becoming something more than mere steel, a weapon that could cut through shadow itself. Together, they moved as one person split into two bodies. Eryk's warrior training guided their movements, while Elira's power gave them the means to strike at enemies that should have been untouchable. The shadow assassins, suddenly finding their targets capable of fighting back with supernatural force, began to falter and retreat. Lord Matthias's concentration wavered as his carefully laid trap crumbled around him. The shadows he commanded grew weaker, more erratic, as his control slipped. It was Sir Gareth who finally broke through the remaining defenders to reach the traitorous lord. Sword pressed against his throat before he could complete whatever final spell he had been attempting. "Why?" Eryk demanded, approaching the captured traitor with Elira still at his side, their hands still joined and crackling with residual power. "Why betray your kingdom, your king, everything you swore to protect?" Lord Matthias raised his head, pushing back the hood to reveal a face twisted by years of hidden resentment and carefully nursed hatred. "Because this kingdom was meant to be pure," he spat. "Before your great-grandfather's weakness, before the corruption of magical bloodlines, we were strong. The purge should have finished what it started. The purge killed innocent people," Elira said, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. Healers, protectors, those who use their gifts to serve others. Abominations, Matthias replied without hesitation. Creatures that perverted the natural order, that threatened the rightful rule of proper bloodlines. Your ancestor understood this, boy. He knew that magical power in the hands of commoners would eventually challenge royal authority. The depth of his hatred was breathtaking. A poison that had festered in secret for decades, while he smiled and bowed and offered counsel at the royal table. Eryk realized with sickening clarity that this betrayal ran deeper than personal ambition or political disagreement. It was ideological warfare disguised as loyal service. "You're not the only one, are you?" Eryk said, reading the truth in the older man's eyes. "There are others among my council, among the nobility, who share your views." Matthias smiled, an expression devoid of warmth or humanity. "The true blood of Vaelthorne will not suffer contamination gladly. Kill me if you wish. Others will take my place. The kingdom will be cleansed one way or another." The words hung in the air like a curse, promising that this attack was merely the beginning of a larger conflict. As Sir Gareth's men secured the prisoner, Eryk found himself looking around the ancient grove with new eyes. The battle they had just won was not an ending, but a beginning. The first open engagement in a war that had been building in secret for years. "We need to return to the castle," he said finally, though every instinct screamed against leaving the protection of the sacred grove. "If there are other traitors among my council, we need to identify them before they can strike again." Elira nodded, but her grip on his hand remained firm. The power that had flowed between them during the fight had created a connection deeper than mere attraction or political alliance. They were bound now by shared danger and shared purpose, partners in a struggle that would determine not just their personal happiness, but the very future of the kingdom. As they made their way back through the forest, shadowed by guards who now understood that their enemies possessed powers beyond conventional warfare, Eryk reflected on how much had changed since that first moment when he chose his heart over his council's expectations. What had begun as a simple desire for authentic love had evolved into something far more significant, a battle for the soul of Vaelthorne itself. The interrogation of Lord Matthias revealed truths more disturbing than Eryk had imagined possible. In the castle's deepest dungeon, surrounded by stones that had witnessed centuries of royal justice, the traitorous lord spoke with the fervor of a man convinced of his own righteousness. "You want to know about our true enemies?" Matthias laughed, the sound echoing off the damp walls. "Look beyond these walls, boy king. Look to the eastern mountains, where Aldrich the Exile has spent 30 years gathering power and planning his return." The name struck Eryk like lightning. Aldrich the Exile, his own great-uncle, brother to his grandfather, the prince who had been banished for practicing forbidden arts and consorting with dark powers. Family histories claimed he had died in the wilderness decades ago, but the truth, it seemed, was far more dangerous. "Aldrich lives," Brother Marcus confirmed later that evening, his ancient fingers tracing through genealogical records in the castle's library. "And if Lord Matthias speaks truly, he has been building an army in the Shadow Peak Mountains, gathering others who believe the kingdom should return to the old ways." Elira stood beside the window, her arms wrapped around herself as she stared out into the darkness. Since the attack in the grove, she had been different, more aware of the power flowing through her veins, but also more troubled by its implications. "The old ways," she said quietly. "Does he mean the time before the Purge, when magical families worked alongside the crown? Or does he mean something darker?" It was a question that had been haunting Eryk since Lord Matthias's revelations. The records were clear about one thing. Prince Aldrich had not simply been banished for possessing magical abilities. He had been cast out for using those abilities in ways that violated every code of honor the kingdom held sacred. According to the sealed archives, Brother Marcus said reluctantly, Prince Aldrich was discovered attempting to bind demons to his will, to create armies of shadow creatures that would serve his ambitions. Your grandfather had no choice but to exile him, but perhaps banishment was not enough. The crystal amulet they had taken from Lord Matthias lay on the table between them. its dark surface seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it. Even in the secured chamber, surrounded by protective wards that Brother Marcus had hastily erected, the thing radiated malevolence that made the air itself feel thick and oppressive. "This is how they've been communicating," Elira said, her voice tight with disgust. "I can feel the corruption in it, like a wound that refuses to heal. Whoever made this has been trafficking with powers that should never be touched." Eryk picked up the amulet, immediately regretting the decision as cold shot up his arm like poison in his veins. Through the crystal's dark surface, images flickered, glimpses of a fortress carved into living rock, armies of creatures that were neither fully human nor entirely beast, and at the center of it all, a figure whose face bore an unmistakable resemblance to the royal bloodline. "He's coming," Eryk said, the words torn from him by visions he could not fully understand. "Not soon, but soon enough. He knows about Elira, about what she represents." "What do you mean?" Elira asked, moving closer despite the amulet's oppressive presence. "The prophecy," Brother Marcus said, understanding dawning in his ancient eyes. "If the last daughter of the sacred line unites with the rightful king, their combined power could restore the kingdom's magical defenses. But if she falls under the sway of one who has embraced darkness, then those same defenses could be turned against the people they were meant to protect," Elira finished, horror creeping into her voice. "That's why he's waited so long. He's been hoping someone like me would emerge, someone with the bloodline power he needs to complete whatever he's been planning." The implications were staggering. For 30 years, Prince Aldrich had been patient, building his strength while waiting for the right moment to strike. Eryk's choice of Elira as his queen had not created the crisis. It had simply accelerated a confrontation that had been inevitable from the moment she revealed her abilities. "We need allies," Eryk said, setting down the amulet with relief as the visions faded. "If Aldrich has been gathering power for 3 decades, we cannot face him with conventional forces alone." "The other bloodlines," Elira said suddenly. "Brother Marcus mentioned that some families survived the purge. If we could find them, convince them to help, it would mean revealing themselves," the old monk pointed out. "For those who have survived by hiding their abilities, asking them to stand openly against Prince Aldrich would be asking them to sacrifice the safety they've built over decades. Then we offer them something in return," Eryk said, his mind racing through possibilities. "Official recognition, protection under royal law, restoration of their ancestral rights and properties. Make it clear that the age of hiding is over, one way or another." Over the following days, Brother Marcus worked with a network of discreet contacts to identify and reach out to the scattered remnants of the magical families. The response was mixed. Some had grown so accustomed to concealment that they refused to emerge even in the face of existential threat. But others recognized that Prince Aldrich's return would mean death for anyone with magical bloodline, hidden or revealed. They came to the castle in small groups, traveling by night and using routes that avoided the main roads. Each arrival was a revelation that spoke to the kingdom's hidden diversity. The stormcallers from the northern coastal regions, whose ancestors had protected fishing fleets from supernatural tempests. The earth-shapers from the mining territories, who could coax precious metals from stone and stabilize tunnels that would otherwise collapse. The moonweavers from the border forests, whose illusions had once confused enemies and protected refugee populations. Elira found herself at the center of these reunions, her status as the last moon whisper making her something between a living legend and a symbol of lost possibilities. The older members of the hidden families remembered stories their grandparents had told of her bloodline's power, while the younger ones looked to her as proof that magical heritage could coexist with royal authority. "There are perhaps 50 of us in total," reported Theron Stormcaller, a weathered man whose eyes held the deep blue of storm-tossed seas. "Not nearly enough to match what Prince Aldrich has gathered. If the rumors are true, but enough to make a difference," added Mira Earthshaper. a woman whose hands bore the permanent stains of working with metals and stones. Combined properly, our abilities could strengthen the kingdom's defenses in ways that no ordinary army could breach. The training began immediately, taking place in the castle's deepest chambers where ancient protective wards still hummed with residual power. Elira worked with each family group, learning to blend her healing energies with their specialized abilities. While Eryk studied texts that had been hidden since the Great Purge, tactical manuals that described how magical support could enhance conventional military strategies. It was during one of these training sessions that the next revelation struck. Elira was working with a young moonweaver named Celia, trying to weave healing energy into the girl's illusion magic, when something unexpected happened. Instead of simply combining their powers, they seemed to unlock something deeper, a resonance that reached back through generations to touch abilities that had been dormant for decades. "The convergence," whispered old Theron, his face pale with awe. The legends spoke of it. When enough of the bloodlines came together in common purpose, they could awaken powers that none possessed alone. Before anyone could ask what he meant, the air in the chamber began to shimmer with patterns of light that seemed to write themselves across the stone walls. Ancient symbols appeared and faded, messages in languages that predated the kingdom's founding, instructions for rituals and ceremonies that could transform individual abilities into something far greater than their sum. "This is what Prince Aldrich really fears," Brother Marcus breathed, his scholarly mind racing to interpret the shifting patterns of light, not just the return of magical bloodlines to positions of influence, but their unification under a legitimate ruler who would use their power for protection rather than conquest. Eryk felt a chill that had nothing to do with the castle's stone walls. The scope of what they were uncovering went far beyond personal conflict or even dynastic struggle. This was about the fundamental nature of power itself, whether magical abilities would serve those who would protect and nurture, or those who would dominate and destroy. "We need more time," Elira said, her voice strained from the effort of channeling powers she was only beginning to understand. "The convergence, if we can master it, if we can bring together enough of the bloodlines, we might have a chance against whatever Prince Aldrich has been building. But time, as they would soon discover, was the one resource they did not possess. Even as they worked to unlock the secrets of the ancient bloodlines, messages were arriving from the kingdom's border posts, reports of strange armies moving in the darkness, of creatures that should not exist marching under banners that bore the twisted symbols of powers better left forgotten. The war for Vaelthorne's soul was about to begin, and whether the kingdom emerged from the coming darkness would depend on their ability to master forces that had been sleeping since before their great-grandfathers were born. The forged royal seal was perfect in every detail except one. It was warm to the touch when it should have been cold stone. Eryk held it in his palm, staring at the familiar engravings that had authenticated his commands for months, while the terrible truth crystallized in his mind like ice forming on still water. "How long?" he asked quietly, not yet looking up at the man who had betrayed him more completely than he had thought possible. Lord Aldrich, not the exiled prince, but his own trusted advisor, the man who had served as his father's closest friend and had been like an uncle to Eryk himself, stood before the throne with his head bowed in what might have been shame or merely resignation. "Since before your father died," Aldrich admitted, his voice carrying none of the warmth that had once made him Eryk's most valued counselor. "Since the day I realized that the kingdom's survival depended on preventing exactly what you have chosen to do." The words hit Eryk like physical blows. Every piece of advice, every expression of concern, every moment of seeming support had been calculated manipulation. The man he had trusted above all others had been orchestrating his downfall from the very beginning. "You killed her family," Elira said from beside the throne, her voice steady despite the pain that radiated from her like heat from a forge. It wasn't frightened villagers or superstitious farmers. It was you, Lord Aldrich finally raised his eyes, and Eryk saw there not the kindly mentor he had known, but something cold and implacable that had been hidden behind masks of affection and loyalty. The Moon Whispers had to be eliminated, Aldrich said simply. They were the keystone. Without their bloodline, the ancient powers could never be fully awakened. I thought the task was complete until she appeared here, displaying abilities that should have died with her grandmother. So you tried to poison her, Eryk said, understanding flooding through him like poison in his own veins. And when that failed, you sent Lord Matthias and his shadow assassins. Matthias was a useful fool, Aldrich replied dismissively. A man whose prejudices made him easy to manipulate. He never understood that this was not about racial purity or noble bloodlines. It was about preventing the return of powers that could reshape the very foundations of royal authority, brother. Marcus stepped forward from where he had been cataloguing the ancient texts, his weathered face twisted with disgust. You feared that magical bloodlines working with the crown would diminish your own influence. This was about maintaining your position, not protecting the kingdom. Was it? Aldrich asked, his tone suggesting genuine curiosity. Tell me, brother, what happens when the king's power derives not from divine right or inherited authority, but from his connection to magical forces that most of his subjects fear and despise? How long before those same subjects decide they need a different kind of ruler? The question struck at fears that Eryk had been trying not to acknowledge. The power he had felt flowing through him during the battle in the grove, the connection he shared with Elira, they had felt natural and right. But would his people see them the same way? You're saying that by choosing Elira, I'm undermining the foundations of monarchy itself, Eryk said slowly. I'm saying that by choosing her, you're transforming the monarchy into something it was never meant to be, Aldrich replied. Your ancestors ruled through strength of arms and purity of bloodline. If you bind yourself to magical powers, future kings will be expected to do the same. And what happens to the kingdom when a king arises who lacks such connections? What happens when the people decide that magical ability matters more than royal birth? The argument was seductive, playing on legitimate concerns about stability and succession. But Elira's hand on his arm reminded Eryk of truths that transcended political calculation. What happens to a kingdom whose ruler is willing to murder innocents to preserve his own power? She asked Aldrich directly. What kind of stability is built on fear and genocide? The kind that lasts, Aldrich replied without hesitation. The kingdom has been strong for 3 centuries because it learned to suppress forces that could not be controlled. Magic is seductive, girl, but it is also corrosive. Give people access to supernatural power, and they begin to question why they should bow to anyone at all. It was then that Sir Gareth entered the throne room, his face grim with news that Eryk knew would be terrible before the captain spoke a word. Your Majesty, Sir Gareth said, his voice tight with controlled fury, we have discovered the extent of the deception. Lord Aldrich has been in communication with Prince Aldrich the Exile for months. The Eastern armies are not moving to invade. They are moving to support a coordinated rebellion that was to begin when Lady Elira was eliminated. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking. Not just murder, but treason on a scale that encompassed the kingdom's highest levels of government. Lord Aldrich had been playing a longer game than anyone had imagined, using his position to weaken the crown while strengthening the exiled prince's position. The messages we intercepted speak of a cleansing fire that would burn away magical corruption and restore the kingdom to its proper order, Sir Gareth continued. Your death was to appear accidental, a tragic result of choosing an unsuitable bride who brought dark powers into the royal court. And after I was dead, Eryk asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer, Prince Aldrich would return as the rightful heir, bringing order and stability to a kingdom traumatized by magical chaos, Lord Aldrich said, no longer bothering to deny his role in the conspiracy. The people would welcome him as a savior, and the old ways would be restored. The casual way he spoke of regicide, of murdering the man he had helped raise, chilled Eryk more than any supernatural threat they had yet faced. This was not passion or madness, but cold calculation that reduced human lives to obstacles in a political equation. "There's more," Sir Gareth said reluctantly. "The messages reference other agents throughout the kingdom, merchants, minor nobles, even some among the castle staff. The conspiracy reaches deeper than we imagined." As if summoned by his words, sounds of conflict echoed from the corridors outside the throne room. The clash of steel on steel, shouts of alarm, the crash of something heavy being overturned. Signs that the conspiracy was moving into its final phase, regardless of whether its original timeline had been disrupted. "They're taking the castle," Elira said, her hand moving instinctively to the small knife at her belt. "This was all planned. Reveal the truth, then eliminate us while we're reeling from the betrayal." Lord Aldrich smiled, the expression more chilling than any threat could have been. "Prince Aldrich's forces are already inside the outer walls. Your magical allies are powerful, Boy King, but they are outnumbered and surrounded. Surrender now, and I might be able to convince my nephew to allow you exile rather than execution." Instead of answering, Eryk stood and drew his sword, the blade immediately beginning to glow with the green light that had become familiar during his training with Elira. Around the throne room, the scattered members of the hidden bloodlines took defensive positions, their various abilities manifesting in ways that made the air itself shimmer with power. "Sir Gareth," Eryk said quietly, his voice carrying absolute authority, "secure Lord Aldrich. Whatever happens next, I want him alive to answer for his crimes. And after that, Your Majesty?" Eryk looked at Elira, seeing in her eyes not fear but determination, the same quality that had allowed her to survive the murder of her family and build a new life from nothing. Together, they represented something that had not existed in the kingdom for generations, the union of royal authority and magical wisdom, working in partnership rather than opposition. "After that," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word, "we show Prince Aldrich and his followers what the kingdom becomes when its people stand united instead of divided by fear." The sounds of battle grew closer, and through the throne room's high windows, Eryk could see smoke rising from different parts of the castle. The final confrontation was beginning, and everything they had worked to build, the alliance of bloodlines, the restoration of magical heritage, the hope for a kingdom based on inclusion rather than suppression, would be decided in the hours to come. But as he stood beside Elira, feeling power flow between them like a river finding its course, Eryk realized that the betrayal had accomplished something Lord Aldrich had never intended. It had stripped away the last illusions about compromise or gradual change. The kingdom would either embrace its magical heritage completely or lose it forever. There could be no middle ground. "The convergence ritual," Elira said urgently, her thoughts clearly following the same path as his own. "If we can complete it while the bloodlines are all here together." "The castle is under siege," Brother Marcus pointed out, his voice strained but determined. "The ritual requires precise concentration and uninterrupted time. How can we achieve either under these circumstances?" It was Theron Stormcaller who provided the answer, his weather-beaten face creased with grim satisfaction. "We hold them off long enough for the ritual to be completed. The bloodlines working separately can delay an army. The bloodlines working together can stop one." The plan that emerged was desperate but achievable. While Eryk and Elira worked to complete the convergence ritual in the castle's deepest chambers, the surviving members of the magical families would use their abilities to create a defensive perimeter that conventional forces could not breach. It would require them to reveal themselves completely, abandoning 3 generations of careful concealment. But the alternative was extinction. As they prepared to leave the throne room, Lord Aldrich called out one final time, his voice carrying a note of what might have been genuine regret. "Boy, you still don't understand what you're unleashing. Magic corrupts those who wield it. I've seen it happen to the best of men. Your great-uncle was a good man once, before the dark powers claimed him. How long before you follow the same path?" Eryk paused at the threshold, looking back at the man who had shaped so much of his understanding of kingship and responsibility. For a moment, he could almost see the person Lord Aldrich claimed to be, a loyal advisor trying to protect his king from a terrible mistake. "Perhaps you're right," he said quietly. "Perhaps magic does corrupt those who seek to use it for personal gain or to maintain power over others. But what if it serves those who seek to protect and heal? What if the corruption comes not from the power itself, but from the fear of losing control?" He didn't wait for an answer, knowing that Lord Aldrich was beyond persuasion. The older man had committed himself to a path that could only end in victory or destruction. There would be no third option. As they descended toward the deep chambers where the convergence ritual would take place, the sounds of battle grew both closer and more desperate. Through the narrow windows, cut into the castle's ancient stone, they could see fires burning throughout the town below, while strange shapes moved in the darkness between buildings, creatures that belonged in nightmares rather than the waking world. "Prince Aldrich has brought more than human soldiers," Mira Earthshaper observed, her face pale as she watched something with too many legs scuttle across the courtyard. "The rumors were true. He has been trafficking with powers that should never have been awakened." "Then we answer darkness with light," Elira replied, her voice carrying a certainty that seemed to strengthen everyone around her. The convergence was created for exactly this purpose, to unite the bloodlines against threats that no single family could face alone. The chamber they entered was older than the castle above, carved from living rock and decorated with symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. Here, the kingdom's magical families had once gathered in times of great crisis, their combined abilities serving as the realm's ultimate defense against supernatural threats. The last time this ritual was performed was during the Demon Wars, 400 years ago, Brother Marcus said, consulting texts that had been hidden since the Great Purge. "It requires representatives of at least 5 bloodlines, working in perfect harmony to channel power through the sacred geometry of the chamber itself." They had 7 bloodlines represented, more than had gathered in one place since before the kingdom's founding. As they took their positions around the chamber's central altar, a piece of crystalline stone that hummed with residual energy, Eryk felt the weight of history settling around them like a mantle. "Whatever happens," he said, looking around at the faces of people who had risked everything to answer his call. "Whatever the cost, you have all chosen courage over fear. That matters regardless of the outcome." Elira's hand found his as the ritual began, and immediately the chamber filled with light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, not harsh or blinding, but warm and encompassing, like sunlight filtered through leaves. Each bloodline added its own color and texture to the growing radiance, the deep blue of storm winds, the rich brown of fertile earth, the silver shimmer of moonlight, the golden warmth of healing energy. But it was when their individual powers began to merge and amplify each other that the true scope of what they were awakening became clear. The light in the chamber grew brighter, more complex, weaving patterns that spoke to parts of the mind that had no names. Ancient defenses stirred to life throughout the castle and beyond. Wards that had been dormant for centuries, suddenly blazing with renewed purpose. Above them, the sounds of battle began to change. Cries of alarm replaced the clash of weapons, as Prince Eldric's supernatural allies found themselves facing defenses they could not penetrate or even understand. The convergence was working, but Eryk could feel the strain it was placing on everyone involved. This level of power was meant to be wielded by dozens of trained practitioners, not the handful of survivors they had managed to gather. "Hold," Elira whispered, her face pale with effort, but her voice unwavering. "Whatever the cost, we hold until the defenses are fully activated." The ritual reached its climax just as the chamber's doors exploded inward, revealing Prince Aldrich himself, older than the portrait suggested, his face bearing the marks of decades spent consorting with dark powers, but still unmistakably royal in bearing and feature. Behind him came creatures that defied description, beings of shadow and malice that left frost in their wake. "Nephew," the exiled prince said, his voice carrying harmonics that hurt to hear, "you have grown into your power admirably, but you still do not understand what you are truly facing." The convergence light flared brighter, and for a moment it seemed that the ancient defenses would be enough. But Prince Aldrich raised his hand, revealing a crystal amulet that pulsed with darkness so complete it seemed to devour the light around it. The chamber's protective wards began to crack and fail, unable to withstand power that drew its strength from realms where light itself had never existed. "Did you think I spent 30 years in exile learning nothing?" Prince Aldrich asked, advancing into the chamber despite the pain that crossing the threshold clearly caused him. "Did you imagine that the old ways were the only ways to command supernatural forces? The ritual was failing, its carefully woven patterns unraveling as darkness pressed against light in ways that violated the fundamental order of creation." Around the chamber, members of the bloodlines began to collapse from exhaustion, their individual abilities overwhelmed by the effort of maintaining the convergence against such opposition. It was then that Eryk made the choice that would define everything that followed. Instead of trying to preserve the ritual's original form, he opened himself completely to the power flowing through the chamber, not trying to control or direct it, but simply becoming a conduit for forces older and stronger than any individual will. The transformation was immediate and terrifying. Light blazed from his eyes, his voice, the very air around him, as centuries of accumulated magical energy found expression through someone who had been trained from birth to bear responsibility for others. He was no longer simply a king who could channel magical power. He had become something new, a fusion of royal authority and mystical force that had not existed since the kingdom's founding. "This is what you truly fear," he said to his great-uncle, his voice carrying harmonics that made the chamber's ancient stones ring like bells. "Not that magic will corrupt the crown, but that the crown might prove worthy of magic's trust." The final confrontation had begun. The battle standard of the true king had not been seen in 4 centuries, its crimson silk bearing the ancient symbol of crown and tree intertwined, royal authority rooted in the living earth itself. Now it flew from the castle's highest tower, visible throughout the kingdom as a declaration that could not be misunderstood. The old order was ending, and something new was being born in fire and blood. Eryk stood in the castle's war room, his transformed state making him appear both more and less than human. Light still played beneath his skin like captured lightning, and when he moved, the very air seemed to bend around him. The convergence ritual had changed him permanently, fusing his royal heritage with magical forces in ways that made him something unprecedented in the kingdom's long history. "The reports are troubling," Sir Gareth said, spreading maps across the great table. "Prince Aldrich's retreat was tactical, not a true defeat. His forces have regrouped in the Thornwood Valley, and our scouts report that more creatures are arriving from the eastern mountains, things that should not exist in this world." Elira moved to stand beside Eryk, her own transformation less dramatic but no less significant. The convergence had awakened abilities in her that went far beyond healing, making her a conduit for powers that had slept since her bloodline's near extinction. Together, they represented something that neither could have achieved alone, a partnership that transcended the traditional boundaries between ruler and subject, between magical and mundane authority. "He's buying time," she said, her enhanced senses reading patterns in the reports that others missed, building up power for something larger than simple conquest. "The creatures he's summoning, they're not meant for battle. They're meant for ritual." Brother Marcus looked up from the ancient texts he had been consulting, his weathered face creased with concern. "The binding ceremonies described in the Forbidden Archives require massive amounts of life force to complete. If Prince Aldrich is planning what I think he's planning, he means to tear open permanent gateways to the shadow realms." Theron Stormcaller finished, his voice grim with understanding. not just summoning creatures temporarily, but creating passages that would allow unlimited numbers to enter our world. The implications were staggering. Even with their enhanced abilities, even with the bloodlines united as they had not been in centuries, they could not hope to face the endless hordes that such gateways would unleash. This was not simply a war for the throne, it was a battle for the survival of everything they knew. How long do we have? Eryk asked, though he suspected the answer would not be what they hoped to hear. The ritual requires the new moon, Brother Marcus replied, consulting astronomical charts with growing urgency. 3 days. Perhaps 4 if he encounters complications in gathering the necessary components. 3 days to prepare for a confrontation that would determine whether their world survived or was consumed by darkness. Eryk felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like iron chains, but also a clarity of purpose that burned away doubt and hesitation. "Send word to every loyal house in the kingdom," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. "Tell them that their king calls upon them not just to defend the crown, but to defend the very existence of the world their children will inherit. Any who stand with us will have a place in whatever kingdom emerges from this conflict, and those who refuse will discover what it means to face the convergence united," Elira said, her tone carrying none of the gentleness that had once defined her. The transformation had awakened, aspects of her heritage that went beyond healing, ancient warrior traditions that her bloodline had carried since the kingdom's founding. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation and revelation. Messengers rode out carrying declarations that promised amnesty to those who had been deceived by Lord Aldrich's conspiracy, while also making clear that continued resistance would be met with the full force of the unified bloodlines. The response was mixed but encouraging. Fear of the unknown was balanced by loyalty to the crown, and growing understanding that Prince Aldrich represented something far worse than change. More importantly, other survivors began to emerge from hiding. Families who had concealed their magical heritage for generations stepped forward, adding their strength to the growing alliance. A few descendants of bloodlines thought completely extinct revealed themselves, bringing knowledge and abilities that had been preserved in secret through centuries of persecution. "We have perhaps 200 individuals with confirmed magical heritage now," reported Mira Earthshaper, her organizational skills proving as valuable as her supernatural abilities. "Not all are trained for combat, but all can contribute to the defensive preparations." The castle itself was transforming as the bloodlines worked together to strengthen its ancient protections. Walls that had stood for centuries began to shimmer with protective energy, while the very stones seemed to hum with power that made conventional siege tactics impossible. More subtly, the working relationships between the magical families and the castle's ordinary staff were proving surprisingly harmonious, fear giving way to fascination, as people discovered that their neighbors' secret abilities could benefit everyone. It was during the final day of preparation that the most significant development occurred. Elira was working in the castle's deepest chambers, weaving protective wards with a complexity that would have been impossible before the convergence. When she made a discovery that changed everything they thought they knew about their situation, "The prophecy," she called out, her voice echoing strangely in the ancient stone corridors. "Brother Marcus, we need to look at the prophecy again." The old monk hurried down the stairs, followed by Eryk and several others. What they found in the chamber defied easy explanation. The walls themselves were writing and rewriting text in languages that predated the kingdom, messages that seemed to appear and fade according to their own mysterious logic. "The binding Prince Aldrich seeks to create," Elira said, her enhanced abilities allowing her to read meanings that flickered at the edge of comprehension. "It's not just about opening gateways. He's trying to recreate something that was destroyed long ago, a connection between our world and realms of pure darkness that existed before the first kings ever took their thrones, brother." Marcus studied the shifting text, his scholarly mind working to piece together implications that grew more terrifying with each passing moment. The original prophecy wasn't about preventing conquest, it was about preventing the unmaking of reality itself. Prince Aldrich doesn't want to rule the kingdom. He wants to transform it into something that never should have existed. The revelation reframed everything they had been planning. This was not a battle between different philosophies of governance or competing claims to the throne. This was a struggle between order and chaos, between a world where life could flourish and one where existence itself became a form of suffering. "Then we give him what he least expects," Eryk said, his transformation allowing him to see patterns and possibilities that mortal perspective could never encompass. Instead of trying to prevent his ritual, we use it as an opportunity to complete something far more significant. The plan that emerged was audacious beyond anything they had previously contemplated. Rather than simply defending against Prince Aldrich's assault, they would allow him to begin his binding ritual, then redirect its massive energies toward a convergence that would unite not just the magical bloodlines, but every person in the kingdom who chose to stand for light rather than darkness. "It's never been attempted," Brother Marcus warned, his voice tight with concern. "The risks, if we fail, if we miscalculate even slightly, we could destroy everything we're trying to save. And if we succeed?" Elira asked, though her enhanced senses already knew the answer. "If we succeed," Eryk replied, "we create something that has never existed. A kingdom where every citizen is connected to the same source of power that protects and sustains the realm. No more hidden bloodlines, no more fear of magical abilities. Everyone becomes part of the convergence." The implications were staggering. Instead of a kingdom ruled by those with supernatural abilities, they were proposing to create one where supernatural abilities were shared by all who chose to participate. It would require a level of trust and cooperation that had never been achieved. But it would also eliminate forever the divisions that had allowed fear and prejudice to flourish. As the final hours before Prince Aldrich's ritual approached, Eryk found himself standing alone on the castle's highest balcony, looking out over a kingdom that might cease to exist in any recognizable form within the next day. The responsibility was crushing, but so was the opportunity. They stood at a moment when choices made by a few individuals would reshape the destiny of countless generations. Elira joined him in the darkness, her presence bringing comfort that went beyond words or touch. Together, they had traveled from that first moment when he chose his heart over political expediency to this ultimate test of whether love and trust could triumph over fear and hatred. "Are we ready?" she asked, though she already knew that readiness was impossible for what they were about to attempt. "No," he admitted, his honesty as intimate as any declaration of love. "But we're committed, and sometimes that has to be enough." In the distance, supernatural fires began to blaze in the Thornwood Valley as Prince Aldrich's ritual commenced. The final battle was beginning, and with it would come either the dawn of a new age or the ending of everything they held dear. The siege engine of ancient design rolled across the Thornwood Valley like a mountain come to life, its crystalline core pulsing with energies that made the very air writhe and twist. No mortal hands had built this monstrosity. It was a fusion of Prince Aldrich's dark magic and technologies that belonged to realms where different physical laws held sway. Behind it marched armies that defied description, creatures pulled from nightmares and given flesh through rituals that had cost the lives of hundreds. From the castle walls, Eryk watched the approaching horror with eyes that could perceive far more than human sight allowed. The convergence had changed his vision along with everything else, letting him see the threads of dark power that connected Prince Aldrich's forces like a web of malevolent energy. Each creature was bound to his great-uncle's will through pain and fear, their individual consciousness subsumed into a collective that existed only to destroy and consume. "The engine is drawing power from the ritual site," Elira observed, her own enhanced senses, reading the flow of energy across the battlefield. Every step it takes toward us strengthens the binding ceremony. He's not just attacking the castle, he's using our resistance to fuel his working. The tactical brilliance of the strategy was as horrifying as it was effective. Prince Aldrich had turned their very defiance into a weapon against them, ensuring that the longer they fought, the stronger his position became. It was a trap centuries in the making, designed by someone who understood both conventional warfare and supernatural forces with the expertise born of desperate obsession. "Then we give him what he wants," Eryk said, his transformed voice carrying harmonics that made the castle's ancient stones resonate in sympathy. "We fight with everything we have. We feed energy into his ritual, and at the crucial moment, we reverse the flow." Sir Gareth looked up from the siege preparations, his weathered face creased with concern. "Your Majesty, the risk, if the timing is wrong. If we miscalculate, then we fail magnificently rather than surrender ignobly," Eryk replied, his words carrying the conviction of someone who had moved beyond fear into a realm of absolute commitment. "Ready all forces. We meet them in the valley on ground of our choosing." The decision to abandon the castle's defenses shocked even his closest advisors. But Eryk's reasoning was sound. The ancient fortress was designed to withstand conventional siege, not the reality-warping energies that Prince Aldrich commanded. Better to face their enemies, in open combat where the unified bloodlines could maneuver freely and the convergence could build to its full potential. The descent from the castle to the valley floor felt like crossing between worlds. With each step away from the ancient stones, the weight of history seemed to lift from their shoulders, replaced by something far more immediate and terrible, the responsibility for choices that would echo through eternity. Behind them came 200 individuals with magical heritage, their abilities awakened and unified, as they had not been since the kingdom's founding. Ahead waited forces that represented the antithesis of everything they fought to protect. The first clash came as the armies met in the valley's center, conventional weapons striking against supernatural defenses in combat that belonged more to legend than to any current understanding of warfare. Eryk moved through the melee like lightning given form, his sword blazing with power that could cut through both flesh and shadow. Beside him, Elira wove patterns of healing and protection that kept their forces fighting, despite wounds that should have been mortal. But it was the sight of the common soldiers, men and women with no magical heritage, fighting alongside creatures they had been taught to fear, that truly marked this battle as unprecedented. Fear was giving way to trust, as people discovered that the supernatural abilities of their allies were used for protection rather than domination, for healing rather than harm. The siege engine pressed forward despite their resistance, its crystalline core growing brighter with each life its forces claimed, each act of violence feeding energy back to Prince Aldrich's ritual site. Through the chaos of battle, Eryk could feel his great-uncle's presence like a cold wind, patient and implacable, confident that time was working in his favor. It was then that the first of the gateways began to open, tears in reality itself that revealed vistas of realms where light had never existed, where the very concept of hope was a foreign intrusion that had to be eliminated. Creatures poured through these rifts that made Prince Aldrich's earlier forces seem mundane by comparison, beings of pure malevolence that left corruption in their wake. "The binding is accelerating," Elira shouted over the sounds of combat, her voice tight with strain as she channeled protective energy around their position. "We have minutes, not hours, before the gateways stabilize permanently." Eryk nodded, feeling the moment of decision rushing toward them like an avalanche. Everything they had planned, everything they had hoped to achieve, would succeed or fail in the next few crucial minutes. The convergence energies were building around them, fed by the desperate courage of people fighting for their world's survival. But they needed more. They needed the massive power that Prince Aldrich's ritual was generating. "Now," he said simply, and reached out to grasp the flows of dark energy that connected the siege engine to its master. The sensation was like grasping lightning with bare hands while standing in a river of ice. Power beyond imagining flowed through channels that had been designed for corruption and destruction, energies that fought against any attempt to redirect them toward constructive purpose. But Eryk was no longer entirely human, and the convergence had given him resources that no single individual had ever possessed. Around him, the unified bloodlines added their strength to his effort, their combined will working to reverse the flow of power that Prince Aldrich had been building for decades. The siege engine shuddered and began to crack as the energies it channeled suddenly reversed direction, its crystalline core overloading from forces it was never designed to contain. But Prince Aldrich was not defenseless. Even as his carefully constructed ritual began to unravel, he struck back with powers that seemed to draw strength from the destruction itself. The ground beneath their feet cracked and bled, while the very air became thick with malevolence that made breathing an act of defiance against despair. The crown of united bloodlines materialized in the space between worlds, its form shifting between physical reality and pure energy, as powers beyond mortal comprehension shaped it from the convergence itself. Neither gold nor silver, neither crystal nor stone, it appeared as something that existed in the spaces between. Elements, a fusion of royal authority and magical heritage that represented everything the kingdom could become. Prince Aldrich stood at the center of his collapsing ritual, his form wreathed in darkness that seemed to devour light itself, yet somehow diminished by the failure of his grand design. The siege engine lay shattered around him like the bones of some primordial beast, its crystalline core dark and fractured. The gateways he had torn in reality flickered unstably, their connection to the shadow realms weakening as the energies that sustained them were redirected toward purposes he had never imagined. "You still don't understand what you're destroying," he said, his voice carrying harmonics of genuine grief beneath the corruption that had claimed him. "This world is dying, nephew. The old magics are fading, the ancient protections crumble year by year. I sought to replace them with something stronger, something that could endure the coming darkness." Eryk approached his great-uncle with sword raised but not threatening, the blade's green fire casting light that revealed the true scope of the devastation around them. The valley had been transformed into something between battlefield and ritual site, where the boundaries between natural and supernatural had been dissolved completely. "By sacrificing everything that makes existence worthwhile," Eryk replied, his transformed voice carrying compassion despite the magnitude of Prince Aldrich's betrayal. "You would have saved a world by destroying its soul." Around them, the battle continued, but with decreasing intensity, as Prince Aldrich's forces found themselves cut off from the power that had sustained them. The creatures summoned from shadow realms began to fade, without the ritual energies that had given them substance in this reality, while the human collaborators found themselves facing opponents whose cause they could finally see clearly. Elira moved to stand beside Eryk, her own transformation making her appear like a figure from the kingdom's oldest legends, the last daughter of a bloodline that had protected this realm since before written history began. In her hands, she held energies that could heal wounds that went deeper than flesh, powers that could restore what had been broken on levels that transcended the merely physical. "There's still a choice," she said, addressing Prince Aldrich directly. "The corruption hasn't claimed all of you. I can see the part that remembers what you fought for originally. Let us help you remember who you were before the darkness took hold." For a moment, something flickered in Prince Aldrich's eyes that might have been the man he had once been, the uncle who had taught a young prince to read the stars, who had shared stories of the kingdom's glorious past, who had believed that power should serve justice rather than itself. But the moment passed, crushed beneath the weight of decades spent trafficking with forces that demanded increasingly terrible prices. "It's too late for that," he said, raising his hands as darkness gathered around him like living shadow. If I cannot save this world through strength, then I will spare it the agony of slow decay. Better a quick ending than lingering death. The final spell he wove was not one of conquest or domination, but of annihilation, a working designed to unravel the fundamental forces that held reality together. It was the ultimate expression of despair disguised as mercy, the choice to destroy rather than allow others to build something better from the ruins of what had been. But the convergence was stronger now than when the battle began, fed by the courage of people who had chosen hope over fear, trust over suspicion, unity over division. As Prince Aldric's spell of ending took shape, it met resistance from hundreds of individuals whose combined will refused to accept that destruction was inevitable. Eryk felt the power flowing through him reach levels that should have torn him apart, energies that represented not just the magical bloodlines, but every person in the kingdom who had chosen to stand for something greater than themselves. The crown of united bloodlines settled onto his head, its impossible substance bonding with his transformed nature to create something that had never existed before. A ruler whose authority derived not from birth or conquest, but from the freely given trust of those he served. "You're wrong, uncle," he said, his voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in the very structure of reality itself. "This world isn't dying, it's being reborn. And rebirth requires both ending and beginning, both loss and discovery." The confrontation between annihilation and transformation played out on levels that transcended physical combat. Two visions of the future clashed in realms where thoughts became forces and intentions shaped the fundamental laws that governed existence. Prince Aldric fought with the desperate strength of someone who had sacrificed everything for a cause he believed just, while Eryk drew upon the collective hope of people who had discovered that their differences were sources of strength rather than weakness. The moment of resolution came not with violence, but with understanding. As the two powers met and merged, Prince Aldric finally saw what his great-nephew was trying to build, not a restoration of the old ways or an embrace of chaos, but something genuinely new. A kingdom where magical abilities were shared rather than hoarded, where diversity was celebrated rather than feared, where power flowed upward from the people rather than downward from authority. "I see," Prince Aldric whispered, his form beginning to dissolve as the darkness that had sustained him was overwhelmed by light. "You're not trying to rule them, you're trying to become them." The transformation that followed touched every person in the kingdom who chose to accept it. Not forced upon anyone, not demanded as the price of citizenship, but offered freely as a gift that came with both abilities and responsibilities. Those who accepted found themselves connected to the same source of power that flowed through the bloodlines, their individual talents and perspectives adding new dimensions to the convergence. When the light finally faded and the valley returned to something approaching normal reality, the kingdom that remained was fundamentally different from the one that had existed when the sun rose that morning. The castle still stood, the rivers still flowed, the people still went about their daily lives, but beneath the surface of ordinary existence, connections had been forged that would reshape everything that followed. Eryk stood with the impossible crown still blazing on his head. No longer simply a king, but something unprecedented, a focal point for energies that belonged to everyone who chose to participate in the great working they had all created together. Beside him, Elira smiled with exhaustion and triumph. Her role as the last daughter of the healing bloodlines transformed into something new, the first of a generation, that would know no division between magical and mundane abilities. The final confrontation was over, but the true work was just beginning. The wedding rings of true union were fashioned not from gold or silver, but from the same impossible substance as the crown of united bloodlines, metal that existed in the spaces between elements, forged from the convergence itself, and blessed by every bloodline that had contributed to the kingdom's transformation. They rested now on a simple wooden table in Elira's cottage. which had somehow survived the cosmic upheaval that had reshaped the very foundations of reality. 6 months had passed since the battle in Thornwood Valley, and the kingdom of Vaelthorne was still learning what it meant to be a realm where every citizen could touch the same sources of power that had once been the exclusive domain of hidden bloodlines. The transition had not been without challenges. Some people struggled to adapt to abilities they had never imagined possessing, while others found the responsibility of such power overwhelming, but the overall transformation had exceeded even Eryk's most optimistic expectations. "The harvest reports are extraordinary," Sir Gareth said, reviewing documents that would have seemed like fantasy just months before. "Crop yields are up 40% across the kingdom, and we haven't had a single case of plague or serious illness since the convergence. The Earth-Shaper techniques are being taught in every farming community, while the healing knowledge spreads faster than we can train instructors." Eryk nodded, though his attention remained focused on the window that looked out over the village where his journey had truly begun. Children played in the streets below, their laughter carrying notes of power that would have terrified their grandparents. But there was nothing fearful in their abilities. These were games of creation rather than destruction, displays of wonder rather than weapons. "What about the neighboring kingdoms?" he asked, knowing that Vaelthorne's transformation had not gone unnoticed by rulers who still governed through traditional means. "Curious, but cautious," Brother Marcus reported, his role as royal advisor expanding to include managing diplomatic relations with realms that were still trying to understand what had happened to their former ally. "King Aldwin of Drakmore has requested formal discussions about trade agreements, while the southern kingdoms seem to be adopting a policy of watchful waiting. They're afraid we'll try to export the convergence," Elira said, entering the cottage with her arms full of flowers from the garden where medicinal herbs grew alongside roses that bloomed in impossible colors. "They see what we've become and worry that we'll force the same transformation on them." It was a reasonable fear, Eryk acknowledged privately. The power that flowed through Vaelthorne's people could easily overwhelm conventional defenses if turned to conquest. But the convergence itself seemed to create a natural resistance to such impulses. Those who tapped into its energies found themselves drawn toward creation and protection rather than domination. "Perhaps that's why the old bloodlines were persecuted," he mused aloud. "Not because magical power corrupts, but because it makes traditional forms of oppression impossible. It's hard to rule through fear when your subjects can defend themselves. Difficult to maintain artificial hierarchies when everyone has access to the same fundamental forces." The observation was proven daily throughout the kingdom. Noble families, who had expected to maintain their positions through inherited privilege, found themselves needing to demonstrate actual competence and service to their communities. Merchants who had built fortunes on artificial scarcity discovered that their customers could create many of their own necessities. Authority was flowing to those who earned it through wisdom and dedication, rather than those who claimed it through birth or wealth. "The transformation isn't complete yet," Elira said, arranging her flowers in a vase that seemed to shimmer with inner light, a wedding gift from Mira Earthshaper, who had learned to blend her metalworking abilities with artistic vision in ways that created beauty as well as utility. "There are still communities in the remote regions who haven't fully accepted the convergence, and some of the older noble families continue to resist the changes." "Change takes time," Eryk replied, settling into the chair where he had first asked her to become his queen, a conversation that felt like it had taken place in another lifetime, though barely a year had passed. "We can't force people to embrace abilities they fear, any more than we could force them to love a queen they didn't understand." The wedding itself had been a revelation that surpassed even the convergence in its demonstration of how profoundly the kingdom had changed. Instead of the elaborate court ceremony that tradition demanded, they had chosen to exchange vows in the sacred grove where Elira's powers had first fully manifested. Representatives from every community in the kingdom attended, not because protocol required it, but because the people themselves had requested the privilege of witnessing the union that had made their own transformation possible. Lord Cassius, who had initially opposed the match so vehemently, had personally presided over the ceremony. His own abilities, a gift for understanding complex economic patterns that bordered on prophecy, had made him invaluable in managing the kingdom's transition to a society where traditional concepts of wealth and value were being redefined. Daily, I never imagined I would see nobility and commoners working side by side as equals, he had confessed after the ceremony, watching as former enemies collaborated on projects that benefited everyone. I thought such cooperation was impossible, that hierarchy was necessary to maintain order. But when everyone has access to real power, artificial distinctions become meaningless. Even Lord Aldrich, after months of confinement and careful healing, had begun to show signs of recovery from the corruption that had claimed him. The process was slow and uncertain. Decades of trafficking with dark powers could not be undone quickly, but Elira's abilities, enhanced by the convergence, could reach wounds that went deeper than flesh or mind. "He asked to see you," she mentioned, noticing the direction of Eryk's thoughts. "The healers think he's ready for a conversation that doesn't involve delirium or rage." The prospect of facing his former advisor, the man whose betrayal had nearly destroyed everything, filled Eryk with emotions too complex to name. Anger was there, and hurt, but also something that might have been pity for someone who had become so lost in fear that he had forgotten what he was originally trying to protect. "Tomorrow," he said finally, "after we've had time to process today's reports and prepare for what that conversation might reveal." The afternoon passed peacefully, with the kind of domestic contentment that had seemed impossible during the dark months of conspiracy and battle. Eryk found himself thinking of his parents, wondering what they would have made of the kingdom their son had helped create. His father had been a good king by the standards of his time, but those standards had been built on assumptions that the convergence had proven false, that power was a finite resource that had to be hoarded, that magical abilities were dangerous precisely because they were rare. "Do you ever regret it?" Elira asked as evening approached, her question encompassing not just their marriage, but everything that had flowed from that first choice to follow his heart rather than his counsel's expectations. "Which part?" he replied, though he already knew his answer. "Choosing you over political convenience? Risking the kingdom's stability for the chance to build something better? Fighting a war that could have destroyed everything we were trying to save? All of it. Any of it?" Eryk considered the question seriously, looking out over a village where children played games that would have been called miracles in his grandfather's time, where former enemies worked together on projects that served the common good, where the very air seemed lighter because it carried the hopes of people who had learned to trust rather than fear. "No," he said simply. "Even knowing what it would cost, even understanding the risks we were taking, I would make the same choices again. The kingdom we were preserving wasn't worth saving. It was built on fear, prejudice, and the suppression of everything that makes life worth living. What we have now, what we're still building, is something worthy of the sacrifices it required." As if summoned by his words, a soft knock came at the cottage door. Eryk opened it to find a small delegation from the village. Thomas the baker, whose life Elira had saved from poison. Celia the moonweaver, whose abilities had helped unlock the convergence. And several others whose courage during the dark times had helped hold the community together. "Majesty." "Lady Elira," Thomas said, his weathered face creased with a smile that spoke of contentment rather than mere politeness. "We wanted to thank you not just for today, but for all the days that have followed since you chose to stand together. The kingdom you've given us," Celia added. "It's not just about the abilities we've gained or the security we feel. It's about hope. The knowledge that tomorrow can be better than today, that our children will inherit a world where their gifts are celebrated rather than feared, They stayed for an hour, sharing stories of changes both large and small that had rippled through their community since the convergence. A blacksmith who had discovered he could forge tools that never dulled, their edges held keen by will as much as metal. A teacher whose students learned not just facts but wisdom, their minds opened to understanding that transcended mere knowledge. Farmers whose fields yielded not just food but beauty, crops that nourished both body and soul. After the delegation departed, Eryk and Elira sat together in the gathering darkness, watching stars emerge in a sky that seemed somehow more alive than it had before the convergence. The cosmic forces they had touched during the transformation had left their mark on everything, making the boundary between natural and supernatural less absolute than previous generations had believed. "There will be challenges ahead," Elira said, her enhanced senses already detecting currents of change that would reshape their world in ways they could not yet imagine. "Other kingdoms may see us as a threat or try to corrupt the convergence for their own purposes. And we still don't fully understand all the implications of what we've created." "True," Eryk agreed. "But we face those challenges together, not just the two of us, but everyone who chose to be part of this transformation. That unity, that shared commitment to something greater than individual ambition, that's our real strength." He reached for her hand, feeling the power that flowed between them as naturally as breath. The convergence had made them partners in ways that transcended traditional marriage, binding them through connections that would endure as long as the kingdom itself survived. "Besides," he added, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to trust in possibilities rather than limitations, "we've already done the impossible once. Whatever comes next, we'll face it the same way we faced Prince Aldrich and his shadows, with courage, wisdom, and the knowledge that love is stronger than fear." As night settled over Vaelthorne, the kingdom dreamed dreams of futures that previous generations could never have imagined. Children whose abilities would reshape the world. Communities bound together by shared power and purpose, and at the center of it all, a union that had begun as one man's choice to follow his heart and had become the foundation for a realm where every citizen could touch the infinite. The story was ending, but the kingdom it had birthed was just beginning. And in that beginning lay all the promise of tomorrow.